In chapter 8, we talked about how exogenous shocks can change the price and quantity in a nice simple model with supply and demand, right? We said, okay, our endogenous variables, our models, our variables inside the model are price and quantity. And our exogenous variables are anything else that can affect supply and demand. And and that's a useful model, right? We say, okay, well, what happens if there's an increase in supply, or what happens if there's a tax added? How can these exogenous shocks change the equilibrium? And so one of the things we're going to look at here in chapter 11 is how those exogenous shocks lead to those changes, right? And when the law of one price will hold, when will it not, when will markets clear, when will they not clear? Um, and what's going on within the actual markets in order to reach that new equilibrium. So in order for something to change in the market, we need to have some sort of endogenous response, right? We need to have some reason that firms are willing to change their prices or increase or decrease their production, and why consumers uh, will be willing to pay that different price. Um, we'll also later in the chapter look at sort of asset prices and bubbles. Um, but really what we want to look at is sort of the role of economic rents, right? So there's an old joke where an economist and an investment banker are walking down the street and they pass a $100 bill. And the investment banker stops and says to the economist, why didn't you pick up that $100 bill? And the economist says, well, if it had any value, somebody else would have picked it up already. At which point the investment banker picks it up, puts it in his pocket, and says, yep, you're right. So the idea is someone needs to pick up those $100 bills in order to get to our new equilibrium. And when economists only focus on those equilibriums, then they might miss out on picking up the $100 bills. So let's think about what happens when there's some sort of shift, right? When there's an exogenous shift. So in this case, we start here at A. We're in the market for hats. And our original price is $8, and we're making 24,000 hats. And then there's an increase in demand, right? And so this increase in demand could come from just an increase in taste. People like to wear more hats. Or it could come from an increase in the number of buyers, right? Maybe we are selling not just to our local market, but to a larger market. But there's an increase in demand. And so our demand curve shifts out from this dotted red line to this solid red line. And typical equilibrium analysis would say, okay, we move from point A to point C. The price increases from $8 to $10, and we, produce 32,000 up from 24,000. But then the question really is, well, how do we get there, right? And what's going to happen originally is that firms are going to sell out, right? If they keep their price at $8, then there's excess demand. People want to buy, almost 35,000 or more than 35,000, 37,000 hats at $8. And so you're a firm, you say, oh, I sold out all my hats. And so what do? Well, you can raise the price. And as you raise the price, you'll find that the price actually goes above the new equilibrium, right? We go to point B. Here we are at something like $14, and we sell all those hats. But now there is an incentive, right? Now you're selling at a much higher price. Your costs presumably are the same. Your supply curve hasn't moved, so you're making a lot of profit. Now there's an incentive for other firms to get into the market, or for you to sell more hats yourself. And so now we increase supply, and eventually, as supply increases, price will have to fall, right? We can't sell 30,000 hats at $14, so we have to drop the price until we get to the new equilibrium. And so this is really rent-seeking behavior, right? Profit maximizing behavior. And that's what gets us to our new equilibrium. So the thing to keep in mind, whether we're talking about microeconomics or next semester if we're talking about macroeconomics, is that prices ultimately come from the interaction and the interests of buyers and sellers, right? Firms will raise prices when they are able to, right? Because that will increase their profits. And buyers will always, try to pay the lowest price that they can. And so the market organization is going to determine how these relationships influence prices, right? If you're in a market where there's bartering, that's going to affect the price. If you're in a market where there's no bartering, then that will affect the price. If you are buying stocks, that's going to be a different price experience than if you're buying a car or if you're buying a pair of pants or you're going to a restaurant to buy a meal, right? So that market organization is really going to determine how those prices are reached. So let's think about the difference between the short run equilibrium and the long run equilibrium, okay? So here at point A, we have an original short run equilibrium, right? We're holding the number of firms constant. And so at point A, you can see we are actually above our zero economic profit curve, which is this lower one. And so in that case, we have this supply curve. We're at point A. We have a price of €2, and we're selling bread here. So we're selling, what is it? It looks like 4,800 loaves of bread. But because we're above our zero economic profit curve, that means that the bakers in this market are earning a positive profit. And people are looking at that and say, "Ooh, look at that baker. He's driving a Mercedes. He must be, doing really well, right?" And so in the long run, what we would expect is more people to enter the market, more firms to get started, and an increase in the supply. And so as the supply increases, because of the new firms, we move, to point B and then to point C. At point C, that's that zero economic profit, right? Remember, that doesn't mean zero accounting profit. You can still earn an accounting profit. It's just that you're not earning a higher profit than anybody else. And so in the long run, what we would expect is that price should equal the marginal cost, and that marginal cost should equal the average cost when we're taking into account the opportunity cost of that capital, right? So it's not that the bakers aren't earning any profit, it's that they're not earning more profit than anybody else. If they couldn't sell their bakery and use that capital somewhere else to earn more of a profit. Now, obviously, this is in a stylized model of perfect competition. In the real world, there are some industries that have much higher profit margins than other industries. So that means that the number of firms in the short run is exogenous, right? It takes time to create new firms. It takes time for people to recognize the economic opportunity. It takes time for them to create new firms and enter the market. But in the long run, they will do that. And so the number of firms is endogenous in the long run. The interesting thing, I think, to think about when we're talking about the short run and the long run is that the long run is always sort of in the distance, right? We're always actually in the short run, and we're sort of moving towards the long run, but that doesn't mean we actually get there. And so that's an interesting point, is that, well, the long run, it's not like we get to the long run at some point and the economists all say, okay, everybody stop. We're at the long run, right? No, things are going to be changing. Maybe now bakers aren't making any money, but computer chip manufacturers are making money, or car manufacturers are making money, or restaurants are making money, right? And so we're always going to be moving around due to technological shocks, due to taste shocks, due to all things that are going on. And that means that supply is more elastic in the long run as more firms enter production, right? It'll be flatter in the long run than in the short run, which means, that we'll have less of a difference between quantity and price, so less of a relationship. Um, so, and that can be true of demand as well, right? Demand, if we think about demand for gasoline, for example, in the short run, it's going to be fairly inelastic because people have the cars that they have to get to work. And so if the price goes up, you're still going to buy almost as much gas. But in the long run, well, in the long run, people can make different choices. They can buy more fuel efficient cars. They can move to a place closer to their work so they don't have to drive as far, or they can walk or take, public transportation. And so in the long run, the demand elasticity will also be more elastic than in the short run. So this is looking at oil and sort of the price of oil versus the supply of oil. And the key point here is that prices provide information, right? And so this was Friedrich Hayek's main insight, was that as a price goes up, that means that a good is becoming more scarce, right? Either more costly to produce, or more difficult to produce or whatever. And as it becomes cheaper, it's becoming less scarce. And so, there's been a question of, all right, well, what about oil, right? Oil is a natural resource, and there's some maximum amount of oil that we can produce. It's been referred to as peak oil. And after that, we're going to start running out. And if prices just stayed constant, right? If prices didn't convey any information, then that would definitely be the case. But what this graph is showing is that as prices go up, supply is also going up because we're able to find new sources for oil, things like shale oil and fracking. And uh, so what we would expect is never really to run out of oil, right? That doesn't really make sense from an economic point of view. What we would expect is that as oil becomes more and more scarce, as it becomes more and more difficult to pull it out of the earth, the price will go up and up and up until at some point it's no longer economically feasible to take the oil, out of the earth. Um, and by that point, we better hope that we have some good alternatives in place. And that's one reason that you might, as a policy, want to encourage things like electric cars or solar power, wind power, things like that. So if the short run fluctuations reflect short run scarcity, right, then supply will be somewhat inelastic because we don't have the new oil wells drilled yet. We have OPEC, which is the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries that controls supply, and those shocks will drive the short run price, but in the long run, it'll be more about long run scarcity. And so as we eventually use up the oil, we will have to we'll see the price go up, and we'll have to find some other alternative.